You know how usually when you get a medical diagnosis, there's this like comforting expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, yeah. Like it's engineering or something.
Right, exactly. You fall off your bike, your arm swells up, you go to the hospital, and they put you in that very sterile room.
Yeah.
And the doctor pulls up an x-ray, points to a very specific, jagged white line on the screen and just says, there it is. That is the problem.
Right. It's entirely binary. Like the bone is broken or it is not broken. You put a cast on it, and 6 weeks later, it's fixed.
Yeah.
We just inherently crave that kind of visibility, I think. We like our problems to be neatly categorized and physically observable.
Exactly. But then you step out of the orthopedic wing and into, well, the world of the human mind.
And the x-ray machine is completely useless.
Completely. You start looking at neurodevelopment or trauma or, why we suddenly feel a rush of anxiety in a crowded grocery store.
Yeah.
And we're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky.
Yeah, it really is.
You can't just point to a glowing white line on a scan that explains why someone is, afraid of commitment or why a crowd suddenly turns into a mob.
The human mind is, it's the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. There is no simple cast you can apply to a behavioral pattern.
And that is exactly where we're heading today. Welcome to your custom-tailored deep dive. We know you love those sudden aha moments, and you love learning how the world works.
But you probably hate feeling overwhelmed by a million disjointed facts and academic jargon.
Right. So today, we're going on a very specific mission. Consider this your ultimate shortcut to being, incredibly well-informed about the architecture of human behavior.
And our foundation for this exploration is fantastic. We are working off a massive, comprehensive, 9-unit AP Psychology full exam review script.
Yeah, created by Desiree Clemens.
Right, a mental health professional, the master's in psychology.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Even if you are not sitting in a high school gymnasium taking an AP exam this May.
Which, thank goodness.
Yeah, right. But the way this material is structured, it is essentially a masterclass in human nature. It gives us a framework to decode ourselves.
It is a colossal roadmap. But, we aren't just going to read a table of contents to you.
No, definitely not.
We are going to trace the actual evolution of how a human being operates. We're starting at the absolute microscopic level, so the biological hardware firing inside your skull right now.
And then we'll build up to how you perceive reality, how you learn the rules of the world, and, how you store those experiences as memories.
Right. From there, we construct your personality, and finally we zoom all the way out to see what happens to that personality when it gets crushed by the immense pressure of society and crowds.
So we are moving from the electrical spark of a single neuron all the way up to the devastating power of groupthink.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can look at the biology, we have to address a fundamental problem. How do we even know any of this? Because for thousands of years, figuring out the mind was just philosophers sitting in armchairs, making wild guesses. At some point, this had to become an actual science.
It did, but it was a very painful, argumentative birth. The field of psychology didn't just appear fully formed in a lab.
No, it really didn't.
It evolved through intense disagreement. The scientific starting line is generally drawn in 1879 in Germany. A man named Wilhelm Wundt opened the very first psychology laboratory.
Okay.
And his approach, along with his student Edward Titchener, was called structuralism.
Structuralism. So they were trying to find the literal structure of thoughts.
Exactly. They wanted to break the mind down into its most basic fundamental elements, much like a chemist breaks down water into hydrogen and oxygen.
Okay, but how do you do that with a thought?
Well, they relied on a technique called introspection. They would expose a subject to a stimulus, like, say, a ticking metronome or a flower, and ask the person to look inward.
Just look inward.
Yeah, and report every single micro-sensation, feeling, and image that passed through their consciousness.
Which sounds completely exhausting and honestly, totally unreliable.
It was very unreliable.
I mean, imagine I hand you a cold, crisp apple and ask you to scientifically list out the exact sensations of crispness or the pure elemental feeling of redness.
Right.
It's impossible. My crisp is going to be entirely different from your crisp. It's way too subjective to be a hard science.
Highly subjective and highly frustrating for the rest of the scientific community. Which is why an American psychologist, William James, came along and essentially flipped the table.
Good for him.
Yeah, he founded functionalism. James argued that agonizing over the structure of the mind was a waste of time. He was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin.
Oh, interesting. So taking an evolutionary approach.
Exactly. James asked, what does the mind do? How do these mental processes function to help a human being survive, adapt, and flourish in their environment?
That makes so much more sense. It's evolutionary. Don't ask what fear is made of, ask what fear does.
Right.
It keeps you from getting eaten by a bear.
Exactly. But this era of functionalism didn't last peacefully, did it? Because the source script immediately introduces the giant controversial elephant in the room.
Oh, Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud, late 19th and early 20th century. Freud arrives with psychoanalysis and fundamentally shatters the illusion that we are rational creatures in control of our own thoughts.
Yeah, he really threw a wrench in things.
He proposed that the vast majority of our mind is completely hidden from us. We are driven by the unconscious, like a dark basement of the mind, where all our repressed desires, unresolved childhood traumas, and aggressive instincts boil away.
Just secretly pulling the strings of our daily behavior.
Precisely.
It's incredibly dramatic. I mean, it turns every slip of the tongue and every dream into a coded message from the basement.
It does.
But again, as fascinating as Freud is, you can't put an unconscious repressed desire under a microscope.
Right, you can't measure it.
Yeah, if psychology wanted to sit at the adult table with physics and chemistry, they needed measurable data.
Precisely. And that desire for hard data triggered a massive backlash against Freud, leading to the era of behaviorism in the early 20th century.
Okay, so swinging in the complete opposite direction.
Exactly. John Watson, and later B.F. Skinner, took a radical stance. They declared that the mind is a black box. You can't see thoughts, you can't measure unconscious desires.
So they just ignored them.
They argued a true science should completely ignore them. They said psychology should only study what is visible and quantifiable, so observable behavior and how the environment shapes it.
I still find that wild, an entire branch of psychological science that essentially kicks the mind out of the room.
It is wild.
They were just treating humans like highly complex vending machines. You put a stimulus in, you get a behavior out.
Basically, yeah.
But they clearly couldn't ignore internal thoughts forever.
No, they couldn't. By the 1960s, we get the cognitive revolution, and what really sparked this was the invention of the computer.
Oh, that makes sense. A new metaphor.
Exactly. Suddenly, psychologists realized, wait, if a computer has physical hardware and invisible software that processes information, maybe the brain works the same way.
So they finally brought the mind back into psychology.
They did, focusing intensely on how we process, store, and retrieve information. And around this same time, we also saw humanistic psychology emerge with Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow.
Right, pushing back against both Freud and the behaviorists.
Exactly. They argued against all that determinism. They said that humans actually have free will and a drive towards self-actualization.
So the history of psychology is really just a pendulum swinging wildly back and forth between extremes. It goes from subjective introspection to unconscious trauma to mindless behaviorism to computer-like cognition.
It really is.
So where has the pendulum finally settled today?
Today, the gold standard and the lens through which we view everything else in this discussion is the biopsychosocial model.
The biopsychosocial model.
It is the ultimate synthesis. It finally acknowledges that any human behavior is an impossibly complex knot of biological hardware, psychological software, and the social environment you are embedded in.
So you can't just pick one.
No. If you want to understand why someone is severely depressed, you can't just look at their brain chemistry, and you can't just look at their recent divorce. You have to look at their genetic predispositions, their habitual thought patterns, and their cultural support systems simultaneously. You cannot separate them.
That is a deeply satisfying way to look at the world. But to prove any of these complex interactions, psychologists need airtight research methods.
They do.
The holy grail of research, according to the script, is the experiment. It is the only way to definitively prove cause and effect.
That is a crucial distinction. If you want to say variable A causes variable B, you cannot just observe people. You must design a controlled experiment.
Right.
You need an independent variable, the IV, which is the specific thing the researcher manipulates or changes.
Yeah.
And you need a dependent variable, the DV, which is the outcome you measure to see if that manipulation actually had an effect.
Okay. But what if you can't run an experiment? Sometimes psychologists have to rely on correlational studies, right?
Right.
Just looking at existing data to see if two things move together.
Right, but there's a danger there.
And here is the classic trap. Correlation does not equal causation. My favorite example is that if you track the data over a year, Ice cream sales and shark attacks both spike at the exact same time. The graphs correlate perfectly.
They do. They have a strong positive correlation.
But obviously, eating a vanilla cone doesn't physically summon a great white shark to attack you. The math shows they are related, but one is clearly not causing the other.
Right. And the reason for that statistical illusion is what we call a confounding variable. A confounding variable is a third, hidden, unmeasured factor that is actually driving both of the things you are observing.
So what's the confounding variable for the sharks?
In your shark example, the confounding variable is the summer heat. When the temperature spikes, more people buy ice cream to cool down. Simultaneously, when the temperature spikes, more people swim in the ocean, drastically increasing their exposure to sharks. The heat is the true invisible cause of both.
Wait, if the world is full of these hidden confounding variables, how does a proper experiment actually get rid of them? Like, if I'm testing a new miracle drug that claims to improve memory, how do I know some hidden factor isn't skewing my results?
The ultimate weapon against confounding variables is random assignment. Imagine you gather 100 volunteers for your memory drug study.
Okay.
If you let the volunteers choose which group to be in, you are ruining your experiment. Maybe all the naturally curious, healthy, highly educated people choose to take the new drug, and the apathetic, sleep-deprived people choose the placebo group.
Oh, right. So your results will be completely confounded by their pre-existing health and intelligence?
Exactly.
So you take the choice away.
Exactly. Random assignment means every single one of those 100 participants has an exact equal mathematical chance of being put in the experimental group. Who gets the real pill, or the control group who gets a sugar pill? You flip a coin.
But wait, if it's just flipping a coin, what if the coin is just, unlucky? What if, purely by chance, you accidentally flip all the highly anxious, sleep-deprived people into the control group anyway? Doesn't random chance still leave room for confounds?
That is a great question, and the answer relies on the law of large numbers.
The law of large numbers.
Right. If you only have 10 participants, yes, a coin flip might accidentally group all the anxious people together. But if you have 100 or 1,000 participants, the statistical probability of all the anxious people or all the geniuses landing in one group approaches zero.
So it evens out.
Random assignment forces all those hidden variables, the good sleepers, the bad diets, the anxious personalities, to distribute equally across both groups. It creates two groups that are, on average, identical.
So then, if the two groups are identical in every single way, and the only difference is that one group gets the real pill, and suddenly that group has vastly superior memory, it wasn't their diet or their sleep or their anxiety. It had to be the pill.
Precisely. And to make it utterly bulletproof, you use a double-blind procedure.
Right, double-blind.
This means the participants don't know if they are taking the real pill or the sugar pill, which eliminates the placebo effect. And the researchers handing out the pills also don't know who is getting what. That eliminates researcher bias, preventing a scientist from unconsciously giving hints to the experimental group.
That makes total sense.
If the results are statistically significant, meaning the math shows it's highly unlikely to be a random fluke, you have proven causation.
Okay, the methodology is sound. We know how to study the machine. Now let's open up the hood and look at the physical hardware of the brain itself, the meat computer.
It all begins at the absolute microscopic level with the basic building block of the nervous system, the neuron. You have nearly 100 billion of them. The easiest way to visualize a single neuron is to picture a tree.
A microscopic tree.
Right. At the very top of this tree are the branches, which we call dendrites. The sole job of the dendrites is to act as receivers. They listen for incoming chemical signals from neighboring neurons.
Okay.
When a signal hits the dendrites, it travels down into the trunk of the tree, which is the cell body, or the soma. The soma is the life support center. It processes the incoming signals.
And it essentially acts like a bouncer, right?
A bouncer.
Yeah, like it sits there assessing the signals coming in from the dendrites, deciding if there is enough stimulation to pass the message along.
Exactly. And if the soma decides the signal has breached a specific threshold, it fires an electrical impulse down the long, single root of the tree. That long root is called the axon.
The axon.
The axon's job is to carry the message away from the cell body and pass it to the next neuron in line. Now, to make sure this electrical impulse travels fast enough, because you need to pull your hand away from a hot stove instantly, the axon is wrapped in a protective fatty insulation called the myelin sheath.
The script points out that the myelin sheath is incredibly important because if that insulation starts to degrade or get attacked by your own immune system, the electrical signals start leaking and glitching.
Right, they slow down or stop completely.
And that breakdown of myelin is exactly what causes multiple sclerosis. You lose muscle control because the signals literally can't reach their destination efficiently.
Exactly.
But let's zoom in on the actual firing of the neuron itself. This electrical impulse traveling down the axon is called the action potential. And the rule here is the all-or-nothing principle.
Yes, the neuron either fires or it doesn't.
I always use a very specific, slightly gross household analogy for this. The action potential is exactly like a flushing toilet.
Okay, I am extremely curious how you connect neurobiology to plumbing.
Think about the mechanics. When you press the handle on a toilet, you can't half flush it. You press it, and for a second, nothing happens until you hit a specific threshold.
Right.
The moment you cross that threshold, a mechanical sequence takes over, and the toilet completely flushes with 100% of its force. You can't stop it halfway. A neuron is identical. The cell body receives stimulation, and if it crosses the threshold, voltage-gated ion channels rip open, and an electrical charge sweeps down the axon at full power. You don't get a weak action potential or a strong action potential. It is all or it is absolutely nothing.
That is shockingly accurate.
Right. And just like a toilet, a neuron has a refractory period, a brief moment where it has to reset its water level, or in this case, its chemical balance, before it can possibly fire again.
The mechanics align perfectly. So this toilet flush of electricity reaches the very end of the axon down at the roots, which are called the terminal buttons.
Okay, the terminal buttons.
But here is the profound twist in human biology. Neurons don't actually physically touch each other. There is an incredibly tiny microscopic gap between the terminal buttons of one neuron and the dendrites of the next. That gap is called the synapse.
Wait, if there is a physical gap, how does an electrical charge jump across empty space? It's not a spark plug.
It doesn't jump. The communication system changes mediums. It goes from an electrical signal inside the neuron to a chemical signal between the neurons.
Oh, wow.
When the action potential hits the terminal buttons, it bursts open tiny sacs that release chemical messengers into the synapse. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters. They float across the fluid-filled gap and bind to specific receptor sites on the dendrites of the next neuron.
Like a key sitting perfectly into a lock.
Precisely like a lock and key. If the shape of the neurotransmitter matches the shape of the receptor, it unlocks the next neuron, telling it to either fire its own action potential or telling it to quiet down and stop firing.
And these chemicals, these microscopic keys floating in the dark, are essentially the source code for every single thing we feel, think, and do.
They absolutely are.
The script highlights the major players we need to know. First is dopamine. People always call it the pleasure chemical, but it's really about reward, motivation, and voluntary physical movement.
Yes, and the balance is incredibly delicate. If your brain produces too little dopamine, you lose the ability to initiate smooth physical movement, which is the underlying mechanism of Parkinson's disease, hence the severe tremors.
Right.
But if your brain produces an extreme overabundance of dopamine, it is strongly linked to schizophrenia. We'll dive into that mechanism later. But essentially, too much dopamine makes the brain perceive things that aren't actually there.
Then there is serotonin, which is the master regulator. It balances your mood, your sleep cycle, and your appetite. When serotonin levels crash, it is heavily associated with clinical depression. This is exactly why the most common antidepressants in the world are SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They block the brain from recycling serotonin too quickly, leaving more of it floating in the synapse to keep the mood elevated.
We also have acetylcholine, or AT. This is the messenger that tells your muscles to contract, but it is also vital for forming memories. The deterioration of neurons that produce AT is a primary marker of Alzheimer's disease. As the chemical fades, the memories literally slip away.
We also have the brain's internal braking system, GABA. It is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It tells neighboring neurons, hey, calm down, stop firing.
Right, and if you don't have enough GABA, your brain goes into overdrive, leading to severe anxiety or even seizures.
On the total opposite end of the spectrum is glutamate, which is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter. It screams fire and is deeply involved in strengthening synaptic connections for learning. And finally, endorphins.
Endorphins are our endogenous, naturally occurring morphine. They are potent painkillers released during intense exercise, extreme stress, or deep laughter.
So that is the chemical soup. But zooming out from the microscopic level, we have to look at the physical geography of the brain itself.
Right.
The script breaks this down perfectly. If you imagine the brain, the deepest, lowest parts are the oldest in evolutionary terms. They just handle basic survival. As you move up and outward to the wrinkly surface, you get the newer, highly complex human traits.
Let's start at the base, right where the spinal cord swells as it enters the skull. This is the lower brain, or the brainstem. Deep inside here is the medulla.
The medulla.
The medulla is the absolute autopilot of your body. It controls your heartbeat and your breathing. If you take a severe blow to the back of the head that damages the medulla, you die instantly. There is no conscious thought here.
Wow.
Hanging off the back of the brainstem is the cerebellum, which translates to the little brain. It looks like a miniature cauliflower. Its job is coordinating balance, posture, and fine motor skills.
Oh, right. When someone drinks too much alcohol, the cerebellum is one of the first areas suppressed, which is why a drunk person stumbles and can't walk a straight line.
Exactly. So the lower brain keeps us alive and upright. But just above that, wrapped around the brainstem, is the limbic system. This is the emotional core of the brain.
The emotional core.
And there are two vital structures here. First, the amygdala. It's two little almond-shaped clusters. The amygdala is the brain's raw alarm bell. It instantly processes intense emotions, primarily primal fear and aggressive rage.
It's what makes you jump backward before you even realize the stick on the ground looks like a snake.
Exactly. And sitting right next to the amygdala is the hippocampus, which looks a bit like a seahorse. The hippocampus is the save button of the brain. It is absolutely essential for taking new conscious experiences and forming them into long-term explicit memories.
Think about how profound that physical proximity is. The raw fear center and the memory save button are literally wired right next to each other in the limbic system.
Yeah, evolutionarily, that makes perfect sense.
Right. If you encounter something terrifying, like a predator, you want your brain to instantly aggressively save that memory so you never go near that cave again. It explains why our most traumatic or frightening memories are often our most vivid.
It's a brilliant survival mechanism. But the part of the brain that makes us uniquely consciously human, the part that reads poetry, builds skyscrapers, and worries about the future, is the wrinkly outer layer covering everything else.
The cerebral cortex.
The cerebral cortex.
Yeah.
It is divided into 4 distinct lobes.
Let's map them. At the very front of your skull, behind your forehead, is the frontal lobe. This is the executive boardroom of the brain. It handles abstract planning, complex decision-making, and most importantly, your personality and impulse control. It acts as the parking brake on your primitive desires.
And we know this vividly because of one of the most famous medical cases in history, Phineas Gage.
Oh, Phineas Gage.
In 1848, Gage was a railroad foreman, known for being incredibly responsible, soft-spoken, and hard-working. He was using a massive iron rod to pack explosive powder into a rock. The powder accidentally ignited, and the explosion shot the heavy iron rod like a missile up through his cheekbone, straight through his frontal lobe and out the top of his skull.
Which is horrifying. But the miracle is, he didn't die.
No, he didn't.
He was literally sitting up and talking minutes later. But because that specific real estate of the brain, the frontal lobe, was physically obliterated, the parking brake was gone.
Right.
The responsible, polite Phineas Gage died that day. The man who survived was completely impulsive, highly profane, erratic, and aggressive. The underlying limbic emotions were still there, but the frontal lobe's ability to filter and control them was destroyed.
It proved unequivocally that our personality is not some ethereal soul floating in the ether. It is physically anchored to specific brain tissue. Now, moving backward from the frontal lobe, located at the top rear of the head, is the parietal lobe. Its primary job is processing physical sensations, touch, temperature, and pain from your body.
Okay.
On the sides of your head, right behind your ears, are the temporal lobes, which predictably process auditory information and speech. And finally, at the very back of the skull is the occipital lobe, which is entirely dedicated to processing vision.
Which always seemed counterintuitive to me. Your eyes are in the front of your face, but the visual data has to travel all the way to the back of your head to be processed.
It's like a long journey, yeah.
And speaking of weird routing, the brain has this massive cross-wiring feature. The left hemisphere of your brain physically controls the movement of the right side of your body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body.
Yes. They communicate constantly across a thick, dense bridge of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. But while they work together, the hemispheres have specialized duties. For the vast majority of human beings, the left hemisphere is the absolute dominant powerhouse for language.
Okay, language on the left.
The script requires us to pinpoint 2 highly specific areas on the left side of the brain. First is Broca's area, located in the left frontal lobe. This area controls the actual physical muscle movements required to produce speech.
So if you suffer a stroke that damages Broca's area, the result is tragic. You have perfect comprehension. You know exactly what you want to say, but you physically struggle to form the words. You might only be able to stutter out broken syllables, even though your mind is completely clear.
Contrast that with Wernicke's area, located slightly further back in the left temporal lobe. Wernicke's area is responsible for language comprehension and creating meaningful sentences.
Oh, so it's the exact opposite problem.
Right. If you damage this area, your ability to physically speak is fine. You can talk quickly and fluently, but because you've lost comprehension, the words you are saying make absolutely no sense. It comes out as a word salad. You might confidently say, "The dog blew tomorrow," entirely unaware that it means nothing.
It is terrifying how fragile the machinery is.
It really is.
But let's pivot. Having this impossibly complex chemical-firing meat computer is an evolutionary marvel. But think about the brain's actual physical reality. It is locked inside a pitch-black, silent, thick bone vault.
Right. It has no idea what is happening outside.
It relies entirely on tiny windows to the outside world to feed it data. That brings us to Unit 3, sensation and perception, how the brain actually experiences reality.
And the most important takeaway from this unit is understanding that sensation and perception are two entirely different sequential processes.
Okay, break that down for us.
Hi, Desiree here. Quick pause and a friendly reminder that everything for this lesson is linked below. Notes, slides, and extra help just in case this starts to feel a little overwhelming. And if you're getting value from this, a like, subscribe, or even sharing this with your favorite psych enthusiast really helps us keep making psychology education more accessible and actually fun. And if I inspired you, whether you're a teacher or you just want to start creating your own videos using AI, those tools are also listed below. Now, let's get back into the episode.
Sensation is purely biological. It is the raw, unedited physical data coming into your sensory organs. It is bottom-up processing. Light waves physically striking the retina of your eye, sound waves vibrating the bones in your ear, odor molecules entering your nasal cavity. At the level of sensation, there is no meaning. It is just raw data.
Perception is the magic trick. Perception is top-down processing. It is what your brain does with that raw data once it receives it. Your brain takes those meaningless electrical signals and filters them through your past experiences, your cultural expectations, and your current mood to assign meaning.
Exactly.
Like sensation is hearing a sudden sharp crashing noise in the kitchen at 2 a.m. Perception is your brain instantly realizing, oh, it's just my stupid cat knocking a glass off the counter again, and turning off the fear response.
Exactly. We don't passively record reality like a video camera. We actively construct our reality based on our expectations.
Right.
But before we can even perceive something, our sensory organs have to actually detect it.
Right, the thresholds.
And our biology has strict limits, which we call thresholds. The first is the absolute threshold. This is defined as the absolute minimum amount of stimulus energy required for you to detect it 50% of the time.
Just barely detecting it.
Right. For example, on a perfectly dark, clear night, the absolute threshold for human vision is seeing a single candle flame burning from 30 miles away. If it's 31 miles away, the light waves are simply too weak for your biological hardware to detect.
But the more interesting one is the difference threshold, or the just noticeable difference, the J&D. This isn't about detecting something from nothing. It's about detecting a change in something that is already there. How much does a stimulus have to change before you realize it changed? And the script specifically highlights Weber's law to explain this.
Weber's law is a beautiful mathematical quirk of human perception. It states that our ability to notice a difference is not based on a fixed absolute amount. It is based on a constant percentage of the original stimulus.
Let me ground this in a physical example. If you are blindfolded and I place a 5-pound dumbbell in your hand, you feel the weight. If I secretly add a tiny 1-pound weight to it, making it 6 pounds, you're instantly going to notice the difference. Your brain says, hey, this just got heavier, because 1 pound is a massive 20% increase over the original 5 pounds.
But if you are holding a massive 100-pound barbell, and your muscles are straining, and I secretly add that exact same 1-pound weight to it, you will feel absolutely nothing. Your perception will not register a change because 1 pound is a tiny 1% increase over 100 pounds.
That makes perfect sense.
The raw sensation, that 1 pound, is identical, but your perception of it changes based on the starting point.
I notice this with my television volume all the time.
Oh, yeah.
If it's late at night and the TV volume is at level 4, which is a whisper, and I bump it up just 2 notches to level 6, it suddenly feels incredibly loud. I definitely notice it.
Right.
But if I'm vacuuming and the TV is blaring at level 50 and I bump it up 2 notches to 52, I can't perceive any difference in the sound at all. The original stimulus was too intense for that small change to cross my difference threshold.
It is a perfect demonstration of Weber's law. Now, among all our senses, vision is undeniably the dictator. It consumes more brain real estate than any other sound.
Oh, absolutely.
The script quickly tracks the journey of light. Light waves bounce off an object and pass through the cornea, the clear protective outer layer of the eye. They travel through the pupil, the adjustable dark hole in the center of the iris, and are focused by the lens. The lens projects light onto the retina, the multi-layered tissue lining the entire inner back wall of the eye.
And the retina is where the magic happens because that's where the actual receptor cells live. We have 2 main types. Rods, which are concentrated around the periphery of the retina. Rods are terrible at seeing detail, and they can only see in black, white, and shades of gray. But they are incredibly sensitive in dim light. They are why you can navigate your bedroom in the dark.
And we have cones, which are clustered in the exact center of the retina, the fovea. Cones require bright, intense light to function, but they provide high-definition detail and allow us to perceive the full spectrum of color.
So the rods and cones fire their electrical signals down the optic nerve all the way to the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. But here is where we transition from raw biology to psychology. How does the brain organize those millions of tiny points of light into a coherent picture?
The script introduces the Gestalt principles. Gestalt is a German word roughly meaning form or whole.
Gestalt.
The core philosophy of Gestalt psychology is that our brains are deeply uncomfortable with chaos. We aggressively force order onto the world. We perceive the whole as being greater than the sum of its parts.
Okay, how so?
We use automatic, unconscious rules to group visual data together. One rule is proximity. If you see 6 dots drawn close together on a page and slightly separated from another cluster of dots, your brain automatically perceives them as a single group rather than 6 independent dots. You assume closeness implies relationship.
My favorite Gestalt principle is closure. Our brains hate incomplete pictures, so we just hallucinate the missing data.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Imagine you are driving down the highway at night and you see a neon sign for a motel. But the neon tube for the letter C is entirely burnt out. You don't read M-O-T-E-L with a weird gap. Your brain literally fills in the dark space and perceives the word motel. You force closure on an incomplete shape to extract meaning from it.
Okay, so our brain has taken in raw sensory data and perceived the world around us. We've constructed a reality, but now we have to survive in that reality. We have to adapt.
That brings us to Unit 4, learning.
Right. And in psychology, learning isn't just memorizing flashcards. Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a direct result of experience.
And when you say learning in psychology, you are legally obligated to talk about Ivan Pavlov and his dogs. This is classical conditioning.
It is the foundational pillar of behavioral psychology, and it was discovered entirely by accident.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Pavlov was a Russian physiologist studying the digestive system of dogs. He hooked up precise tubes to the dog's salivary glands to measure how much they drooled when presented with meat powder.
Right.
But he hit a snag. The dog started salivating before the food even arrived.
Why?
They started drooling when they heard the specific footsteps of the lab assistant walking down the hall.
Because their brains had connected 2 events, they realized footsteps mean meat is coming.
Exactly. The script breaks down the specific terminology here, and if you are studying for this exam, you must memorize these 5 terms. First, you have the unconditioned stimulus, the US.
Okay.
This is something that naturally, automatically triggers a response without any learning required. In this case, the meat powder. When a dog smells meat, it naturally triggers an unconditioned response, the UR, which is salivation. Biology does all the work.
Then Pavlov introduced a neutral stimulus, a ticking metronome, or a bell. Initially, when you ring a bell, a dog might look at it, but it certainly doesn't drool. The bell means nothing, but then comes the conditioning phase. Pavlov rings the bell and immediately gives the dog the meat powder. Ring the bell, give the meat. He repeats this pairing over and over. The dog's brain physically rewires itself to associate the sound with the food.
And the final result is the magic trick. Pavlov can now ring the bell and withhold the food entirely. The dog will hear the bell and start aggressively drooling anyway.
That's wild.
The formerly neutral bell has now transformed into a conditioned stimulus, the CS, and the drooling to the sound of the bell is a conditioned response, the CR. The dog has successfully learned to anticipate the future.
But notice that classical conditioning is entirely passive. The dog isn't choosing to drool. Its autonomic nervous system is simply reacting to environmental cues. But human beings and animals do more than just react. We actively operate on our environment to get what we want.
This is where B.F. Skinner enters with operant conditioning.
Learning through consequences.
Exactly. Skinner built on the simple idea that behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely to happen again, and behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. To map this out, Skinner gave us a highly specific, very confusing four-square grid of terminology: positive, negative, reinforcement, and punishment.
I want to stop right here because if you are listening to this, you have to completely delete your everyday colloquial understanding of the words positive and negative.
Yes, please do.
In Skinner's operant conditioning, positive does not mean good or happy. It purely mathematically means adding a stimulus, like a plus sign. Negative does not mean bad or sad. It purely means removing a stimulus, like a minus sign.
And the second half of the equation is the outcome. Reinforcement always, 100% of the time, means your goal is to increase the likelihood of a behavior happening again. Punishment always means your goal is to decrease or stop a behavior.
Let's build the squares. Positive reinforcement. Adding something pleasant to increase a behavior. Example: a teenager gets an A on their math test, so the parents add $20 to their allowance. They added a reward to increase the behavior of studying.
Right. Then there is positive punishment. Adding something unpleasant to decrease a behavior. Example: a teenager stays out past curfew, so the parents add an extra load of awful weekend chores. They added a chore to decrease the behavior of breaking curfew.
Then we have negative punishment. Removing something pleasant to decrease a behavior. Taking away the teenager's smartphone for the weekend because they broke curfew. You removed an enjoyable stimulus to stop the bad behavior. But the final square is the trap, the one that trips everyone up. Negative reinforcement.
People always use negative reinforcement when they're actually talking about punishment. They think it means scolding someone.
It does not.
No, let's follow the strict rules. Negative means removing something. Reinforcement means increasing a behavior. So negative reinforcement is removing an annoying or unpleasant stimulus in order to reward and increase a desired behavior. It is about relief.
Let's use the most relatable example on earth. You sit in your car, you turn the key, and you don't put your seatbelt on. The car immediately starts emitting that high-pitched, incredibly irritating dinging noise. Ding, ding, ding. It drives you crazy.
Oh, I hate that sound.
The moment you buckle your seatbelt, the noise stops. The car removed an unpleasant stimulus, so that's negative, the exact moment you performed the desired behavior, which inherently rewards and increases your likelihood of wearing a seatbelt in the future. So that's reinforcement.
It is brilliant engineering based purely on Skinnerian psychology.
Here's another one. I get a brutal migraine. I take an Advil. 20 minutes later, the blinding pain is gone. The pill removed an unpleasant stimulus, the result. The next time I get a headache, my behavior of reaching for the Advil is massively increased. Taking painkillers is highly negatively reinforced.
Perfectly stated. Now, both classical and operant conditioning require you to actually experience the association or the consequence yourself. But the script points out a massive leap forward in learning theory, observational learning.
Oh, Albert Bandura.
Yes. Bandura famously argued that humans don't have to get shocked to learn not to touch a wire. We can just watch someone else get shocked.
The famous Bobo doll experiment in 1961. This experiment completely upended how we thought about childhood development and media consumption. Bandura took young children and had them sit quietly in a room. In the corner of the room, an adult researcher started aggressively interacting with a Bobo doll.
Those large, inflatable, weighted clown dolls that pop back up when you hit them.
Exactly. And it wasn't just roughhousing. The adults performed highly specific, novel acts of aggression. They hit the doll with a wooden mallet, they threw it in the air, and they yelled very specific, hostile phrases like, "Sock him in the nose," and "Pow."
And the child just sat and watched this adult model this behavior.
Then, Bandura takes the adult out, deliberately frustrates the child by telling them they can't play with certain toys, and leaves the child alone in a room with the Bobo doll. What happened next is chilling.
Yeah, it is.
The children didn't just happen to play aggressively, they exactly, meticulously mimicked the precise behaviors they had observed. They picked up the little wooden mallets, they threw the doll, and they screamed the exact same phrases, "Sock 'em in the nose." They learned violent behavior simply by observing it.
Bandura concluded that observational learning requires 4 specific steps, creating the ARM model. First, attention. You have to actively watch the model. Second, retention. You have to remember what they did.
Right.
Third, reproduction. You have to have the physical capability to actually perform the action. A child can watch a gymnast do a backflip, but they can't reproduce it. And finally, motivation. You must have a reason to perform the behavior.
Okay, so we've covered how we learn behaviors, how we associate bells and food, and how we mimic adults. But where does all this data go? How does the brain hold on to it?
Good question.
This brings us to segment 3 of our journey, the engine of thought. Unit 5, Cognitive Psychology. And listeners, if you are studying for the exam, sit up straight right now because the script explicitly notes that this is the single largest unit on the entire AP test.
It is the absolute core of modern psychology. How do we remember? How do we forget? And how do we solve problems? Let's start with the architecture of memory.
Let's do it.
The dominant framework we use is the information processing model, specifically the Atkinson-Shiffrin multi-store model. It suggests that for a memory to become permanent, it has to successfully navigate 3 distinct stages.
Stage 1 is sensory memory. This is essentially the immediate split-second recording of sensory information. It is incredibly vast, taking in everything your eyes and ears catch, but it is fleeting. Visual sensory memory, called iconic memory, lasts for less than half a second.
Just a flash.
It's just long enough to act as a bridge, keeping the world looking like a continuous movie instead of a series of stuttering photographs.
But if you actually pay selective attention to something in that sensory register, say a phone number someone is dictating to you, it moves into stage 2. Short-term memory, which is often called working memory. This is the workbench of your mind. It is what you are consciously aware of and thinking about right in this exact moment.
But the workbench is incredibly small. In 1956, George Miller published a famous paper discovering the severe limitations of our working memory. He called it the magical number 7 plus or minus 2.
That's 7 items.
On average, human beings can only hold about 5 to 9 discrete items in their short-term memory at one time. And without active rehearsal, those items will vanish into thin air in about 20 to 30 seconds.
It is a severe biological bottleneck. But we have developed psychological tricks to hack it, the most prominent being chunking.
Chunking.
If I read you a sequence of 10 random digits, 4, 1, 5, 8, 6, 7, 5, 3, 0, by the time I get to the end, you've probably forgotten the beginning. 10 items overload the capacity of 7.
But if I format it as a phone number, 449, pause, 867, pause, 5309, your brain automatically groups them. You don't see 10 numbers anymore. You see an area code, a prefix, and a line number. You turn 10 individual items into 3 chunks of data, neatly bypassing the short-term memory limit.
Now, if you rehearse that information, if you actively process it, it passes into the final stage. Long-term memory. This is the limitless vault. We do not know the maximum capacity of human long-term memory. It appears to be practically infinite.
That's amazing.
But it is highly organized into different types. We divide it primarily into explicit memory and implicit memory.
Let's break those down. Explicit memory is conscious, intentional recall. It's the stuff you can deliberately declare out loud. And I like to think of explicit memory as being divided into 2 distinct books in your mind. The encyclopedia and the documentary.
I like that analogy.
The encyclopedia is your semantic memory. This is just cold, hard trivia and facts. Knowing that Paris is the capital of France or that a neuron has an axon. You don't remember the exact moment in 3rd grade you learned it. You just possess the knowledge.
Right. And the documentary, on the other hand, is your episodic memory. These are your personal autobiographical experiences. Remembering the exact smell of the cafeteria on your first day of high school, or the feeling of panic when you lost your keys yesterday. It is tied to a specific episode in time.
And entirely separate from those conscious memories is implicit memory, specifically procedural memory. This is unconscious memory for physical skills and habits. Once you truly learn how to ride a bicycle, you don't have to consciously retrieve the instructions on how to balance. Your body just implicitly remembers.
Getting information into that long-term vault requires encoding. And the script emphasizes a crucial distinction here for students studying. The difference between shallow processing and deep processing.
Shallow processing is just looking at the surface level, like staring at a vocabulary word and noticing it is printed in blue ink, or just repeating it out loud without thinking about it. The memory trace will be incredibly weak.
Exactly. Deep processing, however, focuses on semantic meaning. You look at the vocabulary word, you analyze what it actually means, and most importantly, you connect it to your own personal life. You create an elaborate web of associations. That guarantees a much stronger memory.
The script also provides the ultimate study cheat codes here, the spacing effect and the testing effect.
Yes. Cramming for 6 hours the night before an exam is a horribly inefficient way to encode data. The spacing effect proves that distributing your study sessions over several days yields significantly better long-term retention.
Good to know.
And the testing effect shows that actively forcing yourself to retrieve information, taking a practice quiz or explaining it to a friend, is vastly superior to just passively rereading a textbook chapter over and over.
Okay, so we've successfully encoded all this data. Why do we forget things? Why do I walk into a room and completely forget why I went in there?
The science of forgetting started with Hermann Ebbinghaus in the 1880s. He memorized lists of nonsense syllables and tested his own memory over time, discovering the famous forgetting curve.
The forgetting curve?
He proved that memory decay is incredibly rapid initially. You lose a huge percentage of what you learned within the first 24 hours, but then the curve levels off. Whatever remains after a few days tends to stick around for a long time.
But it's not always just natural decay. Sometimes our memories actively sabotage each other through interference. And the script has a fantastic trick for remembering the two types. Proactive interference versus retroactive interference. You just have to look at the prefix.
Right. Pro versus retro.
Pro means forward. In proactive interference, old, heavily entrenched memories move forward and block you from recalling new information. Imagine you finally change your computer password, but for the first 2 weeks, your fingers automatically type the old password. The old memory is proactively interfering with the new one.
And retro means backward. In retroactive interference, brand new information reaches backward and overwrites or blocks the old information.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine you spent 4 years in high school learning Spanish. Then in college, you spend an intense year learning Italian. Suddenly, you try to speak Spanish, but you can only think of the Italian vocabulary. The new learning retroactively blocked the old learning.
That is the perfect way to keep them straight for the exam. But there's a much darker side to memory, and this is where cognitive psychology gets terrifying. We like to think of our memory as a video camera. You hit record, the event happens, and later you just hit play and watch an exact replay of reality.
And Elizabeth Loftus completely destroyed that illusion. Loftus proved that memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction.
A reconstruction.
Every single time you pull a memory out of the vault, you don't just passively view it, you actively rebuild it in your mind. And while it is out of the vault, it is highly vulnerable to contamination and alteration before you put it back.
The misinformation effect. Loftus ran an incredibly famous experiment. She showed groups of people the exact same video clip of 2 cars getting into a traffic accident. Then she asked them to estimate how fast the cars were going.
But she subtly changed the phrasing of the question for different groups.
Right. For one group, she asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? For another group, she asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other?
And that single verb changed the past.
Kid.
The group that heard the word smashed estimated the cars were traveling significantly faster. Furthermore, weeks later, she asked them if there was broken glass at the scene. There was no broken glass in the actual video, but a large portion of the smashed group confidently remembered seeing shattered glass.
The phrasing of the question literally reached into their brain and altered the physical memory of the event. It makes me have an existential crisis. Are my most vivid childhood memories basically a lie? I have this incredibly vivid memory of getting lost in a mall when I was 4, but now I'm wondering if it even happened.
It might not have. You might be suffering from source amnesia. This happens when we retain the semantic memory of an event. We remember the story, but we completely forget the context of how we acquired it.
So it wasn't me.
You might vividly remember getting lost in the mall, when in reality, you just heard your older sister tell that story about herself at Thanksgiving 10 years ago, and your brain simply absorbed the narrative and incorrectly tagged it as your own autobiographical experience.
That is terrifying.
This fragility of memory is exactly why eyewitness testimony, which used to be considered the absolute gold standard in criminal court, is now viewed by psychologists as notoriously unreliable.
Our engine of thought is undeniably glitchy, and we see those exact same glitches when we move from memory into thinking and problem solving. When we face a problem, our brain has 2 main ways to solve it. We can use an algorithm, or we can use a heuristic.
Right. An algorithm is a methodical, step-by-step, logical rule or procedure that guarantees you will eventually solve the problem. If you were in a massive grocery store looking for hot sauce, an algorithm would be walking down aisle 1, looking at every single item on every single shelf. Then aisle 2, then aisle 3.
Wow, that sounds awful.
It is incredibly tedious and painfully slow, but it is foolproof. You will mathematically guarantee finding the hot sauce.
But the human brain is lazy and wants to save energy. So we rarely use algorithms. We use heuristics. A heuristic is a mental shortcut, a rule of thumb. In the grocery store, your heuristic tells you hot sauce is a condiment. Find the sign that says condiments and only look there.
It is incredibly fast. Most of the time it works. But heuristics are prone to errors. If the store randomly put the hot sauce in the international aisle, your heuristic fails, and you walk out with no hot sauce.
And because we rely on these fast shortcuts constantly, we fall into cognitive traps. One of the most common is the availability heuristic. This is when we judge the likelihood or frequency of an event based purely on how easily examples pop into our minds, how available they are in our memory.
The classic example is shark attacks. After the movie Jaws came out, millions of people refused to swim in the ocean. Because violent shark attacks were highly vivid, emotional, and heavily publicized, they were incredibly available in people's memories.
So they overestimated the risk.
Exactly. Their brains vastly overestimated the actual probability of getting attacked, ignoring the statistical reality that they were more likely to be killed by a falling coconut.
We also rely heavily on the representativeness heuristic. This is judging the likelihood of things in terms of how well they seem to represent or match our internal prototypes while completely ignoring actual base rate statistics.
Give me an example of that one.
Imagine I describe a man named Steve. Steve is very shy, withdrawn, incredibly organized, and loves reading in quiet rooms. Then I ask you, is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a retail salesperson?
My immediate gut instinct says librarian, because he perfectly matches the prototype of a librarian.
Exactly. Your heuristic says librarian. But if you stop and think about the statistical base rates, there are hundreds of thousands more retail salespeople in the country than there are librarians. Statistically, it is vastly more probable that Steve is just a shy retail worker. But our brains ignore the math in favor of the matching shortcut.
And the absolute king of cognitive errors, the trap that dictates modern society, is confirmation bias. This is our natural, aggressive tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs, while actively ignoring, dismissing, or forgetting any evidence that contradicts us.
We just filter it out.
Right. If you believe left-handed people are more creative, every time you meet a creative lefty, your brain says, proof. But every time you meet a dull lefty or a highly creative righty, your brain just discards the data. You never update your belief.
And modern social media algorithms are essentially massive automated confirmation bias machines. They're designed to feed you content that entirely aligns with what you already click on, insulating you from contradicting viewpoints.
Now, cognitive psychology also covers two uniquely human domains, language and intelligence. On the language front, the script highlights Noam Chomsky. Chomsky completely rejected the behaviorist idea that children just learn language purely through imitation and reinforcement.
Why did he reject it?
He argued that the speed at which toddlers acquire complex grammar is impossible to explain through just rewards. He proposed that humans are born with an innate language acquisition device.
The language acquisition device.
Chomsky believed that the underlying structure of grammar is fundamentally hardwired into the human brain from birth. We have an instinct for language, which is why children soak it up effortlessly during their critical period of development.
And then we get to intelligence. And psychologists have essentially been in a 100-year bar fight over how to define this. Charles Spearman started it by saying intelligence is just one singular, quantifiable thing. He called it the G factor, or general intelligence.
Right.
His argument was that if you score exceptionally high in math, you are highly likely to also score well in spatial reasoning and verbal skills. There is just one underlying engine of raw mental horsepower.
But Howard Gardner violently disagreed.
Yeah.
He proposed the theory of multiple intelligences. He argued that you cannot capture human brilliance with a single IQ test.
What did he propose instead?
Gardner identified 8 distinct, relatively independent types of intelligence. You might have low logical mathematical intelligence, but possess genius-level musical intelligence, or bodily kinesthetic intelligence, which is the physical mastery seen in elite athletes or dancers.
I always push back on Gardner a little bit. Calling bodily kinesthetic and intelligence feels like we are just taking the word talent and rebranding it so everyone feels smart. Is being incredibly good at hitting a baseball really a form of cognitive intelligence, or is it just exceptional hand-eye coordination?
That is exactly the primary criticism of Gardner's theory within the field. If everything is an intelligence, the word loses its specific meaning.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why Robert Sternberg offered a more accepted middle ground with his triarchic theory. Sternberg said there are 3 types: analytical intelligence, the traditional academic problem-solving book smarts, creative intelligence, the ability to generate novel ideas and adapt to new situations, and practical intelligence, everyday street smarts, and the ability to manage oneself and others.
It's a much more balanced view. Now, we've talked about how intelligence and memory function, but these aren't static. An infant's memory is very different from an adult's. This brings us to segment 4, the human arc, unit 6 and 7. We are going to look at developmental psychology, motivation, emotion, and how we form a coherent personality.
Let's track the lifespan. Unit 6 covers developmental psychology, and the undeniable titan of cognitive development is Jean Piaget. Before Piaget, science largely treated children simply as miniature, slightly dumber adults.
Which is pretty funny to think about.
It really is. But Piaget proved that children actually reason in fundamentally different ways than adults do. He mapped out cognitive development across 4 distinct stages.
Stage 1 is the sensor motor stage. This is from birth to about 2 years old. Babies in the stage don't have abstract thoughts. They experience the entire world purely through their senses, looking, hearing, touching, mouthing, and grasping.
And the monumental milestone they must achieve here is object permanence. This is the sudden realization that an object continues to exist even when it is hidden from sight.
Right. Before object permanence develops, if you show a 6-month-old a bright red toy and then put a blanket over it, the child won't look for it. To their brain, the toy literally ceased to exist in the universe.
Out of sight, out of mind. Literally.
This is why the game Peekaboo is utterly mind-blowing and hilarious to an infant. You are literally vanishing from existence and magically resurrecting. But by age 2, they achieve object permanence and Peekaboo becomes boring.
Then they enter stage 2, the pre-operational stage, lasting from roughly 2 to 7 years old. Their language skills absolutely explode, and they can use symbols and engage in pretend play, but their logic is incredibly flawed. The hallmark of this stage is egocentrism.
Egocentrism.
Now, this doesn't mean the child is selfish or arrogant. It means they physically and cognitively cannot perceive a situation from another person's point of view. If a 4-year-old closes their eyes, they assume you can't see them either.
That's so interesting. Around age 7, they graduate to stage 3, the concrete operational stage. Now, logical thinking takes hold. The critical milestone here is the concept of conservation.
Conservation.
I love the videos of this experiment. You take a 5-year-old in the pre-operational stage and you pour exactly 8 ounces of water into a short, wide glass. Then you pour another 8 ounces into a tall, incredibly skinny glass. You ask the kid which glass has more water.
And they always point to the tall one.
The 5-year-old will inevitably point to the tall glass because the water level is physically higher. Their brain is tricked by one dimension. But a 9-year-old in the concrete stage has mastered conservation. They will roll their eyes and tell you the volume is exactly the same, despite the change in physical shape.
Finally, from age 12 onward, we hit stage 4, the formal operational stage. This is when the adolescent brain develops the capacity for abstract, hypothetical, and highly logical reasoning. They can ponder complex moral dilemmas, debate political theories, and grasp abstract mathematical concepts like infinity.
But human development isn't just a cold cognitive ladder. It is deeply emotional and social. We have to attach to other humans to survive. And the script highlights attachment theory, bringing us to one of the most famous and frankly deeply upsetting experiments in psychology history, Harry Harlow's monkey studies in the 1950s.
It is a difficult study to discuss, but it revolutionized how we view infant care. Before Harlow, the prevailing behaviorist and psychoanalytic belief was that infants bonded with their mothers purely because the mother provided a primary biological reinforcement.
No, just hunger.
They believed love was just a byproduct of getting fed. Harlow tested this. He took infant rhesus monkeys away from their biological mothers right after birth and placed them in cages with 2 artificial surrogate mothers.
Describe the surrogates, because the visual contrast is everything.
One surrogate mother was made entirely of bare, cold, uncomfortable wire mesh. However, this wire mother had a bottle of milk attached to it. It provided the biological necessity. The other surrogate mother provided absolutely no food, but it was constructed of soft wood and wrapped completely in warm, comforting terry cloth.
If the behaviorists were right, the infant monkey should bond entirely with the wire mother because it reinforced the hunger drive. But that is not what happened.
No, it isn't.
The infant monkeys completely ignored the wire mother. They clung desperately for up to 22 hours a day to the soft terry cloth mother. They would only briefly stretch over to the wire mother when they were absolutely starving, drink the milk, and immediately throw themselves back into the arms of the cloth mother.
When Harlow frightened the monkeys with a loud mechanical toy, they didn't run to the food source. They ran screaming to the cloth mother and buried their faces in her for security. Harlow proved definitively that contact comfort, the feeling of physical, emotional warmth and security, is just as deeply ingrained and necessary for psychological survival as physical nourishment.
A psychologist named Mary Ainsworth took this foundation and applied it to human babies with her famous strange situation experiment. She wanted to see how variations in that early care affected a child's attachment style. She would bring a toddler and their mother into an unfamiliar playroom. Then, a stranger would enter, and the mother would abruptly leave the room, leaving the toddler with the stranger. Then the mother would return, afflicted. They wanted to be held, but they also punished the mother, crying and pushing her away angrily. They couldn't be soothed.
And finally, avoidant attachment. These children barely reacted when the mother left the room, and when she returned, they essentially ignored her, continuing to play independently as if she didn't exist. They had learned to suppress their attachment needs. And longitudinal studies show that these infant attachment styles heavily predict how we handle romantic relationships, trust, and intimacy in our adult lives.
Which perfectly bridges us into Unit 7, motivation and emotion. Because attachment is a powerful drive. But what motivates human behavior in general? Why do we do anything?
The script outlines a few key theories of motivation. First is the drive reduction theory. This proposes that humans are fundamentally seeking a state of biological balance called homeostasis.
Think of a thermostat.
Exactly. If the temperature drops, the heater kicks on. In your body, if you are deprived of water, it creates an unpleasant physiological state of tension, a drive. That tension motivates you to perform a behavior, drinking a glass of water, to reduce the drive and restore homeostasis.
That makes perfect sense for food, water, and sleep. But drive reduction theory utterly fails to explain why humans ride roller coasters, go skydiving, or watch terrifying horror movies. There is absolutely zero biological need and no homeostasis being achieved by jumping out of an airplane. That is where arousal theory comes in, specifically the Yerkes-Dodson law.
The Yerkes-Dodson law argues that humans are motivated to seek an optimal, moderate level of physiological arousal or stimulation. It's not about zero tension, it's about the right amount of tension. The law states that we actually perform tasks best when we are at a moderate level of arousal.
Think about taking the SAT. If you have absolutely zero stress, if you are half asleep, slouched in your chair, your performance will be terrible. You won't care enough to focus. But if your arousal is too high and you are having a full-blown panic attack, your performance will also crash. You need that moderate sweet spot, just enough nervous energy and adrenaline to sharpen your focus and keep you engaged.
Abraham Maslow attempted to organize all of these different competing motives into a grand, overarching framework known as the hierarchy of needs. He visualized it as a pyramid. His theory states that you must satisfy the lower-level basic needs before you can possibly care about the higher-level psychological needs.
At the very base, the widest part of the pyramid are physiological needs. Air, food, water, sleep. If you have not eaten in 7 days, you do not care about your social status or your career goals. Your entire existence is focused on bread. Once you secure food, you move up one level to safety needs, shelter, financial security, health. Once you feel safe, you move up to love and belonging, friendship, intimacy, family. Then up to esteem needs, respect, status, recognition.
And at the absolute pinnacle of the pyramid is self-actualization. This is the desire to achieve your full, unique human potential, to become the most creative, morally grounded, completely fulfilled version of yourself. Very few people, according to Maslow, permanently reside in this state. Now, heavily intertwined with motivation is emotion. And the specific theories of emotion outlined in the script are notoriously tricky. We have three main contenders trying to explain the sequence of an emotional experience: James Lange, Cannon Bard, and Schachter Singer's two-factor theory.
The James Lange theory is the oldest, and it is entirely counterintuitive. Common sense says, I see a bear, I feel afraid, so my heart races and I run. James Lange flips the script. It argues that your physiological bodily reaction happens first, and that specific bodily reaction causes the conscious emotion.
Wait, really?
Yeah, you see the bear, your heart starts pounding and your muscles clench. Your brain reads that pounding heart and says, oh, my heart is racing, therefore I must be experiencing fear. The body dictates the feeling. But the Cannon Bard theory pointed out a flaw in that logic. Your heart pounds when you are terrified of a bear, but your heart also pounds when you are furiously angry or when you are deeply in love. If the bodily reaction is exactly the same, how does the brain know which emotion to feel? So Cannon-Bart argued that the bodily reaction and the conscious experience of emotion happen simultaneously but completely independently.
Right. You see the bear, and the visual data splits in the brain. One signal goes to your heart to make it race, and a separate signal goes to your cortex to create the conscious feeling of fear at the exact same millisecond.
But modern psychology generally favors the third approach, the two-factor theory by Schachter and Singer. This theory posits that a complete emotional experience requires two ingredients. First, you must have physiological arousal, your heart pounding. Second, you must apply a cognitive label to that arousal based on your environment.
You feel the racing heart, you look around, and you use your brain to figure out why it's racing.
Exactly. If your heart is pounding and you see a bear, you cognitively label the arousal as fear. But if your heart is pounding and you are looking at someone you find incredibly attractive, you cognitively label that exact same physiological arousal as lust or romantic chemistry.
I absolutely love this theory because of the real-world applications.
Oh, yeah. If you are taking someone out on a first date, do not take them to a quiet, boring coffee shop. Take them to a theme park and go on a massive roller coaster or go see a terrifying horror movie. Their heart will be pounding, their palms will be sweating, their adrenaline will be surging purely because of the ride or the movie.
But because they're sitting next to you, their brain looks around for a cognitive label, and they might unconsciously misattribute that physical arousal and label it as intense romantic chemistry with you. The arousal from the environment transfers to the person.
It is a brilliant, entirely valid, and slightly manipulative application of psychological science. Now, wrapping up this arc of the human experience, we reach personality. All these motivations, emotions, and learned behaviors solidify into a stable identity. The script returns briefly to Freud here.
Freud argued that our personality is essentially a war zone between three conflicting entities. You have the id, which is the primitive, animalistic, entirely unconscious part of the mind. It operates purely on the pleasure principle. It wants food, sex, and gratification immediately, regardless of the consequences. Think of it as a screaming toddler.
And on the other extreme is the superego, which is your highly rigid, internalized moral compass. It represents all the rules of society and your parents. It demands utter perfection.
And caught directly in the crossfire is the ego. The ego is your conscious self. It operates on the reality principle. Its entire exhausting job is to try and satisfy the primal desires of the id without violating the strict moral codes of the superego.
And when the ego gets overwhelmed by the anxiety of this constant battling, Freud argued we deploy defense mechanisms to protect our conscious mind. These are unconscious distortions of reality. We might use repression, which is just shoving the traumatic memory deep into the unconscious basement, or, my personal favorite, projection.
Projection is incredibly common in interpersonal conflict.
Exactly. Imagine you are arguing with your partner. Deep down, you are feeling incredibly insecure about the relationship. But admitting that causes too much anxiety. So your ego protects you by taking your own unacceptable feeling and projecting it onto them. You suddenly yell, "Why are you being so insecure and clingy?" You attribute your own hidden flaws to the other person. It completely shifts the blame.
While defense mechanisms remain a highly useful concept in therapy, Freud's overall structure of the id, ego, and superego is largely seen as unscientific and untestable today. The modern standard for assessing personality is the trait theory, specifically the big five personality factors.
You can remember them with the acronym OCEAN. Openness to experience, how creative and willing to try new things you are. Conscientiousness, how organized, reliable, and goal-directed you are. Extroversion, how much energy you draw from social interactions. Agreeableness, how cooperative, trusting, and empathetic you are. And neuroticism, which measures your emotional instability and tendency to experience negative emotions, like anxiety and anger.
What is remarkable about the Big Five is that decades of cross-cultural research demonstrate that these specific 5 traits remain remarkably stable across a person's entire adult lifespan, regardless of what culture they are born into.
Okay, so we've built a stable, functioning human being. We've traced the biology, the learning, the memory, and the personality. But what happens when that incredible stability fractures? Or what happens when the environment around us completely overpowers our stable personality? We are now moving into segment 5, Breakdown in Society, units 8 and 9.
Let's begin with Unit 8, Clinical Psychology. How do professionals define, categorize, and treat mental illness? The absolute Bible of the psychiatric field is the DSM-5. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
And it is crucial to remember our core framework here. The DSM-5 relies heavily on the biopsychosocial approach. It recognizes that a disorder is almost never just a broken brain or just a bad childhood. It is a complex interplay. A person might have a genetic biological predisposition for depression, but that depression might never activate unless it is triggered by a severe psychological stressor in their social environment.
The script organizes the major disorders into distinct categories. We have anxiety disorders, which include generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. This isn't just being nervous about a test. It is a persistent, chronic, free-floating state of severe tension and worry that has no identifiable trigger. We also have panic disorder, which involves sudden, unpredictable, terrifying panic attacks that mimic the physical symptoms of heart attack.
But there is a massive categorical update students need to know. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, used to be considered an anxiety disorder. In the DSM-5, it was pulled out and given its own distinct category.
Yes. OCD is characterized by a brutal cycle. The obsessions are intrusive, unwanted, highly distressing thoughts or mental images that the person cannot suppress. For instance, an overwhelming terror of contamination. The anxiety from these thoughts becomes so unbearable that the person feels compelled to perform. Compulsions, repetitive, ritualistic physical behaviors like washing their hands exactly 30 times. The compulsion temporarily relieves the anxiety, which negatively reinforces the behavior, trapping them in the cycle.
The script also details trauma and stressor-related disorders, specifically PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This is characterized by haunting flashbacks, severe hypervigilance, and emotional numbing that persists long after a life-threatening trauma. We also cover mood disorders, primarily major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. Major depression is not just feeling sad, it is a profound, suffocating despair, a total loss of physical energy and anhedonia, which is the complete inability to feel pleasure.
Bipolar disorder, conversely, involves violent pendulum swings in mood. The person plunges into the depths of major depression, but then swings upward into a state of mania. Mania is characterized by extreme, hyper-elevated mood, a drastically decreased need for sleep, rapid speech, grandiosity, and highly impulsive, reckless behavior.
But the disorder that requires the most careful explanation is schizophrenia. This is a psychotic disorder, meaning it involves a fundamental, terrifying break with reality itself. And the terminology here is very specific. The script highlights the difference between positive symptoms and negative symptoms. And I need you to clarify this because just like in operant conditioning, the word positive sounds like a good thing, which is incredibly confusing when talking about a severe illness.
You have to apply the exact same mathematical logic we used with Skinner. In the context of schizophrenia, a positive symptom means something abnormal has been added to the person's conscious experience. Hallucinations are a positive symptom. The person is hearing voices that are not there. Sensory data has been added to their reality. Delusions are a positive symptom. These are deeply held, false, often paranoid beliefs, like believing the CIA has implanted a microchip in their brain. A delusion is a false thought pattern added to their cognition. Disorganized, chaotic speech is also a positive symptom.
Okay, so a negative symptom means something fundamental has been removed or subtracted from a normal human experience.
Precisely. And negative symptoms are often the most devastating. Flat affect is a negative symptom, a total blank lack of emotional expression on the face or in the voice. Emotion is subtracted. Alogia is a severe reduction in the amount of speech. Avolition is a profound, paralyzing lack of motivation or drive to do anything, even basic hygiene. Their willpower is subtracted.
So what causes this massive fracturing of reality? Biologically, the primary suspect is the dopamine hypothesis.
Yes. Research heavily suggests that an overabundance of dopamine receptors in the brain is intrinsically linked to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia.
Let's dig into the mechanism of that. How does a chemical make you hear voices? Dopamine is heavily involved in salience, telling the brain what is important to pay attention to. If your brain is suddenly flooded with excess dopamine activity, completely random, meaningless background noise, a passing car, a glance from a stranger, a random thought, is suddenly tagged by your brain as incredibly urgently significant. The brain frantically tries to make sense of this hypersalience and constructs hallucinations and paranoid delusions to explain it.
Which is why the primary biomedical treatment for schizophrenia involves administering antipsychotic medications. These drugs are dopamine antagonists. They physically block the dopamine receptor sites, reducing the chemical activity, which often successfully quiets the hallucinations and clears the delusions.
The script also details psychological treatments for other disorders. We have behavioral therapies, which apply the principles of learning we discussed earlier. A prime example is systematic desensitization. used to cure severe phobias.
It relies on classical conditioning. If a patient is terrified of spiders, the therapist first teaches them deep physical relaxation techniques. Then, they gradually, systematically expose the patient to their fear step by step. First, just looking at a cartoon picture of a spider while practicing relaxation. You cannot be physically relaxed and terrified at the same time. Once they master the picture, they move to a photograph, then a plastic spider, then a real spider in a cage across the room. Slowly, the brain breaks the association between spiders and panic and replaces it with an association between spiders and calm.
But the most widely practiced evidence-based therapy today is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, pioneered by Aaron Beck. CBT merges two approaches. The cognitive part involves teaching the patient to actively identify and challenge their catastrophic, distorted thought patterns. The behavioral part involves pushing the patient to actually go out and engage in behaviors that reinforce those new, healthier thoughts. You change the software and you change the output.
Now, we must transition to the final unit, Unit 9, Social Psychology. We have spent this entire time looking deep inside the individual mind. Now, we pull the camera all the way back. What happens to that individual when they step out their front door and interact with the crowd?
And the foundational concept of social psychology is recognizing how deeply flawed our judgment of other people is. This is encapsulated in the fundamental attribution error.
This is perhaps the most important concept in the entire curriculum for daily life. When we observe someone else's behavior, particularly bad behavior, we have an overwhelming, unconscious bias to attribute their actions entirely to their internal disposition, their personality, their character. We completely ignore or underestimate the power of the situational factors surrounding them.
Let's play out the classic example. You are driving on the highway, and a car comes out of nowhere, cuts you off violently, and speeds away. Your immediate, instantaneous thought is, what a selfish, reckless, horrible person. You made an internal dispositional attribution. You decided their behavior is a reflection of their permanent soul, but you completely ignored the situation. What if that driver has a severely bleeding child in the back seat and they are frantically trying to get to the emergency room? In that situation, their reckless driving isn't malice, it's panic. But your brain doesn't grant them that situational grace.
And the irony is crystallized in the actor-observer bias. While we constantly judge others by their character, when we are the ones performing a negative behavior, we do the exact opposite. We blame our surroundings.
Oh, absolutely. If I aggressively cut someone off in traffic, I don't think to myself, wow, I am a terrible, selfish person. I tell myself, I'm a fundamentally good person, but I was forced to do that because the lane was ending, the truck in front of me slammed on its brakes, and I was going to be late for a massive job interview.
We constantly grant ourselves the complex context of the situation, but we deny that context to strangers. Recognizing the fundamental attribution error is the first step toward actual empathy. But social psychology also reveals something much darker: how easily our own behaviors and beliefs are manipulated by the presence of others. The script highlights the trinity of social influence experiments: Ash, Milgram, and Zimbardo.
Let's start with Solomon Asch and conformity. Asch set up what looked like a painfully simple visual test. He brought a single, actual participant into a room with 6 other people. Unbeknownst to the participant, those 6 other people were actors working for Asch. The researcher held up a card with 1 target line on it and another card with 3 different lines. He asked the group, which of these 3 lines matches the target line?
The answer was glaringly obvious. A child could see the correct match. On the first few trials, everyone gave the correct answer. But then the experiment shifted. The researcher held up the cards, and the first actor confidently stated the completely wrong answer. Then the second actor agreed with the wrong answer. Then the third, fourth, and fifth. The actual participant sitting at the end of the table is now staring at a line, knowing the group is wrong, but feeling the immense silent pressure of the consensus.
And the results were stunning. Roughly 75% of the real participants conformed and gave the obviously wrong answer at least once. Some conformed because they simply didn't want to rock the boat and endure the social discomfort of standing out. That's called normative social influence. But some actually convinced themselves that their own eyes must be failing them and the group must possess superior knowledge. That's informational social influence.
That is the power of a group to bend reality. But Stanley Milgram took it a terrifying step further. He wasn't testing conformity to peers, he was testing obedience to authority. Milgram recruited everyday citizens. He had them sit in front of a massive, imposing shock generator. An authority feature in a gray lab coat instructed the participant to ask memory questions to a learner strapped to a chair in the adjacent room. The learner was actually an actor.
And the terrifying rule was, every time the learner gets a question wrong, the participant must push a switch and deliver an electric shock. And the voltage increases with every wrong answer, eventually reaching a maximum of 450 volts, labeled danger, severe shock.
As the experiment progressed, the actor in the other room would begin to grunt, then scream in agony, complain of a heart condition, and eventually fall completely silent, feigning unconsciousness or death. When participants hesitated, sweating and trembling, the man in the lab coat simply stated, "The experiment requires that you continue. You have no other choice."
Before the study, Milgram surveyed top psychiatrists. They confidently predicted that less than 1% of the population, only severe sadists, would go all the way to 450 volts. But they committed the fundamental attribution error. They assumed behavior is driven entirely by internal character. They underestimated the power of the situation. In reality, a staggering 65% of normal, everyday people administered the maximum, potentially lethal shock simply because a calm authority figure told them to. It proved that under the right situational pressure, ordinary people can commit horrific acts.
And that situational power was further confirmed by Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. Zimbardo built a mock prison in a university basement. He took a group of psychologically healthy, normal college students and randomly assigned them to play the role of either guards or prisoners.
The power of the situation took hold immediately through a process called de-individuation. The guards were given khaki uniforms, batons, and most importantly, mirrored sunglasses that hid their eyes, stripping away their individual identity. The prisoners were stripped, given smocks with numbers instead of names, and locked in cells.
Within just a few days, the simulation became harrowing reality. The guards, intoxicated by the power of their role and hidden behind their mirrored glasses, became psychologically and physically abusive. The prisoners, stripped of their identity, became passive, depressed, and subservient. The experiment was intended to run for 2 weeks, but had to be abruptly shut down after just 6 days because the situational roles had completely overwhelmed the students' actual personalities.
It shows that when you put good apples in a deeply toxic anonymous barrel, the barrel often wins. Social psychology also explores the darker side of group inaction, specifically the bystander effect. If you are having a medical emergency on a deserted street and one person walks by, they are highly likely to help you. But if you have an emergency on a crowded city sidewalk with 50 people watching, your chances of receiving help actually plummet.
That is due to the diffusion of responsibility. When you are the only person there, 100% of the moral burden to act rests squarely on your shoulders. If 50 people are there, the responsibility diffuses. Everyone assumes someone else in this crowd has surely already called 911. I don't need to get involved.
And finally, a brief internal struggle caused by our behavior. Cognitive dissonance, a theory developed by Leon Festinger. We possess a deep psychological need for our internal beliefs and our external actions to align perfectly. When they clash, we experience a highly uncomfortable mental tension called dissonance.
Imagine you deeply believe that smoking cigarettes is a lethal, foolish habit. But you smoke a pack a day. Your belief, smoking kills, completely contradicts your action. I am smoking. This creates painful cognitive dissonance. To resolve that tension, you only have 2 options. You either have to stop the action, quit smoking, or you have to change your belief to justify the action. You might convince yourself, well, the science is exaggerated and my grandfather smoked every day and lived to be 90. We constantly construct elaborate rationalizations to protect our self-image from dissonance.
Okay, take a deep breath. We have just successfully navigated the entire architecture of human behavior. We traveled from the chemical locks of a single neuron through the perception of light into the learning of the Bobo doll, stored it in our explicit memory, developed it through Piaget's stages, motivated it with Maslow, diagnosed its breakdowns with the DSM-5, and watched it conform to authority with Ash and Milgram.
It is a massive, comprehensive toolkit.
We did it. We made it through a truly monumental journey.
It is an incredible feeling to step back and look at the whole picture. We have synthesized an immense amount of scientific discovery.
It really is the ultimate shortcut. Whether you are staring down the AP Psych exam in a few weeks, armed with your define, apply, explain formula, or you are just sitting in a boardroom trying to figure out why your coworker is acting so aggressively, remember the fundamental attribution error. You now possess the psychological vocabulary to truly navigate the world. You can see the invisible, biological, and social forces that dictate our lives.
But as we wrap up, looking at the sheer weight of this immense machinery we've uncovered, it raises a deeply profound, lingering question for you to mull over. If our daily behaviors and choices are fundamentally just the result of microscopic neurotransmitters locking into receptors, combined with childhood attachment styles we didn't choose, driven by operant conditioning from our environment, and pressured by the invisible, overwhelming conformity of the crowd, where exactly in all of that cascading biology and social environment does our free will actually begin?
Oh man, that is the ultimate question, isn't it? Our diagnostic x-ray machine is definitely broken, and those waters are as muddy, complex, and utterly fascinating as ever. Thank you for joining us on this incredible, exhaustive deep dive into the human mind. Keep questioning your world, keep looking deeper, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.